was a major part of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of wealthy white New York City patrons will find these exceptionally talented African-American artists and put on productions and demonstrations of their artwork. So a lot of the Harlem Renaissance African-American artists will become wildly famous throughout New York. Here's one by Aaron Douglas called Aspirations. Look at the bottom. It's dark. It gets lighter. It gets lighter towards the top. People on the bottom, clearly they're slaves. Here they are, they're reaching for the top. You don't see their face, they're just reaching. They're in chains. Then you get this middle group. And this middle group is holding articles of education. There's a globe, there's a book, and they're pointing towards, that city on the hill, that future. That's what they're going towards. That's the mural entitled Aspirations. Music was also a huge, huge, huge part of the Harlem Renaissance, what we call today jazz. With the death of James Reese Europe, there was this tremendous void in American popular culture, and that void will be filled by a lot of who will become very famous members of the American jazz scene. Louis Armstrong, U.B. Blake, Florence Mills, Cab Calloway, Bessie Smith, Duke Ellington, Fats Waller. Fats Waller, I would say, was the very first. The first one to attempt to fill the shoes of James Reese Europe. Billie Holiday and Dizzy Gillespie. All of these people will be self-trained. The only one who goes to college is Duke Ellington. He actually gets a degree in music from Harvard. But the rest of these people are self-trained. They really launch the jazz craze. And not just in the United States, but around the world. A lot of them in the interwar years will go to France and perform in nightclubs there. France, once again, as I mentioned about the goal of the first and the only black pilot in World War I, Eugene Bullard, that France was this place of racial equality, and it certainly was. So there's this rather large community of African Americans living in, specifically in Paris. So anyhow, here's another painting entitled Saturday Night Street Scene. There's seemingly some sort of party going on. There's what appears to be a parade, or at least musicians and people milling around the street. Some are dancing, some are observing. And look at the cop in the foreground. He's looking at the looker. He's looking at you as if to say, there's nothing here, move along. Well, the intellectual linchpin of the Harlem Renaissance were these authors. This is Fats Waller, surrounded by these women. They're Broadway performers. He and a few other African American writers and musicians are going to pen a musical called Hot Chocolate. Hot Chocolate is going to be the very first all-black musical on Broadway. There's going to be songs like popular songs called like "Ain't Misbehavin'." That'll come out of this musical. The grandfather of the New Negro movement was this guy, Alan Locke. Alan Locke was born into I don't know if wealthy is the right word, but nearly wealthy African-American family in Philadelphia. He attended and graduated high school, which is very rare, not just for a black person, but for anybody living in the United States. As late as 1945, the year that the World War II comes to an end, only 25% of Americans have a high school degree. Only 25%. So, getting a high school degree in the 1890s was exceptionally rare. Well, not just that, but he goes to Harvard and he becomes a Rhodes Scholar. The Rhodes Scholarship was established by a guy named Rhodes from England, and there's a panel, and they look at the best and the brightest, and they give these scholarships to people all over the world, who then goes to Oxford and spends a few years getting educated in England. President Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Alan Locke was given a Rhodes Scholar in 1907. Now, at that time, the Rhodes Scholarship Committee did not interview the candidates in person. Now they do. So they had no idea that Alan Locke was African American until he showed up. Well, England, like the United States, was a segregated society. So most of the other Rhodes Scholars, especially the Rhodes Scholars from Southern institutions, refused to have anything to do with Alan Locke. They would not dorm with him. They would not eat with him. They would not study with him. So the Rhodes people had a hard time fitting Alan Locke in. Actually, eventually he does. Like I said, he gets his bachelor's from Harvard. He gets his he goes back to Harvard and gets, he teaches at Howard University. He goes back to Harvard and gets a PhD. He's the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. Oh, by the way, when Alan Locke became a Rhodes Scholar in 1907, that will be the last time an African American becomes a Rhodes Scholar until 1960. So, he was an author. He wrote essays and articles for various magazines, and he takes a collection of his work and the work of other African American poets and authorists and essayists, and he binds them together, and he publishes them in 1925 under the title The New Negro. So that becomes the name of this movement in literature, the New Negro. The New Negro movement in American literature was an emphasis on the positive traits of African Americans. Being studious, being educated, being moral, being good members of American society. But it also connected the present with the past. There was a lot of Africana to it. Talking about African culture and African language and African traditions. So it wasn't just completely divorcing themselves. They weren't just black people living in the United States. They had this rich culture that goes back, thousands of years. One of the interesting things that I find about Alan Locke is that he belonged to a religion called Baha'i. Baha'i was established by a man named Baha'i. I forget his first name. And Alan Locke and the founder of the Baha'i religion, they were good friends. They spent years writing letters back and forth to each other. Google it. It's a very small in supporters, a very small religion in this country today. But there were a lot of questions about his sexuality, and he was homosexual, but he was, as the vast majority of men were, really until the 1980s, closeted. So he led this public life, but then he had this private life. So I find it interesting that publicly he could talk about his positive feelings, his support, his pride in being African, and African culture, and African history, and African traditions, and how those all come together to form what it is to be an African American, or to be part of the New Negro movement. But his sexuality, that was something that was still prohibited. Like I said, that's the reality in this country really until the 1980s. Well, next we have Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was a poet. Wrote a few short stories, but primarily known for his poetry. His poetry, like so many other writers of this time, connected the old with the new, African culture, African tradition, African ideas with American ideas, American culture, American tradition. This is an excerpt from one of his poems. I swear to the Lord, I still can't see why democracy means everybody but me. Langston Hughes, like a lot of the writers and poets, the literary giants of the Harlem Renaissance, spent a lot of time talking about racism and sexism and inequality in the United States, and specifically that black people didn't have the same social, political, economic, whatever rights as white people did. Then we have Count Cullen. His name is spelled what appears to be, you would pronounce it Count D, but it's pronounced Count Count Cullen, man, talk about someone we just don't know where he came from. We're not sure where he was born. Lexington, Kentucky, Baltimore, Maryland, New York City. These are three of the places in which historians have found records that suggest he was born there. We're not even sure when he was born. Conventional wisdom said he was born in 1903. We really know nothing about him until he shows up in Harlem in 1918. His parents either died or disappeared. He was raised by a woman that we think was his grandmother. We're not sure. Anyhow, he attends New York University. Once again, this is exceptionally special. This is really important. Your average American doesn't go to high school, and here we had someone going to college. After NYU, he goes to Harvard, and he becomes this classically trained poet. His poetry is much more political, much more aggressive than anything else coming out of the new Negro movement or the Harlem Renaissance. And so his poetry will not be as widely accepted by white society. And by accepted, I mean it's not economically as helpful to him as it is to the writings of Langston Hughes and others. Here's an excerpt from probably his most famous poem called Yet Do I Marvel. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. He becomes destitute later in life and ends up being a junior high school teacher. Finally, we have Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston is different for many reasons. She was from Florida, specifically Eatonville, Florida. Eatonville is the first city in the United States that was incorporated as an all-black city. So she grew up in this all-black city. She grew up very comfortably, not wealthy, but parents who made more than enough money. Her mother was a teacher. Her father was a whole bunch of stuff, to include a Baptist minister. And he was the minister of the largest Baptist church in Eatonville. Well, Zora Neale Hurston was interested in language. She was interested in anthropology. She went to Howard University, eventually Columbia University. She received a Gutenberg scholarship to study anthropology in Haiti. She studied culture and anthropology in Honduras and in Nicaragua. She attempted to tie together African culture with the culture of the Mestizo Indians who live along the Honduran Nicaraguan border area. So she was really interested in multiracial or multicultural aspects. She wrote poems, she wrote short stories, she wrote novels. Her most famous novel was probably Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it's a piece of fiction. That's what a novel is, about a young girl named Janie Crawford, and it follows Janie's life from childhood to adulthood, how she changes and develops and becomes this independent woman. Well, she'll be invited to New York City as she works with Langston Hughes and Count Cullen and Alan Locke and all these major players in the Harlem Renaissance. In their little group, they call themselves the Niggerati. And she falls out of grace because her writings, like I said, she's from Florida, rural Florida, Eatonville, tremendous poverty in rural Florida and in and around Eatonville. And so her writings are what she knows, which is poverty. And so her portrayal of African Americans in her books, in her novels, in her essays, in her writings, are people who she knew. So they were not educated.